Morning, Bangalore. I'm Gaurav. I'm a field engineer based in Australia. So today I'm just going to talk about some of my experiences with Kubernetes, the general trends we are seeing. So first up, this was a survey that we conducted. We sort of noticed that nearly every organization is running multi-cluster Kubernetes. 91% of the teams are running multiple Kubernetes clusters. 71% run Kubernetes on premises, which is the private cloud. 67% are also running in public clouds. And what we are seeing right now is 15% of customers we are talking to are investigating running Kubernetes on the edge. I was fortunate enough to be sort of involved in a massive Kubernetes transformation at a large financial services firm in the ANZ region. We sort of started small and ended up running tens of thousands of containers across multiple Kubernetes clusters, and we supported 300 plus developers. And it was a multi-year journey, like I said, but it was managed by a team of 5. So you can imagine the challenges we faced, the level of automation we had to aim for, because we always wanted to keep ourselves as a lean team. So what I'm going to present now or talk about is, like the blooper reel from sort of what we learned over those 4 or 5 years. So first up was multi-cloud. I'm not sure if anyone follows Corey Quinn on Twitter. He's a cloud economist, and he's hilarious. I would recommend you definitely, have, see what he's up to and, look at his sarcasm. It's pretty hilarious. So this was our challenge when we started, right? That everything worked in theory, but nothing worked in prod. Because we had lots of dev environments in a public cloud, and then we had a path to production, which was hosted in our private cloud, which meant, everything worked in theory, but as soon as we got to prod, nothing worked. And all of this automation was written using Puppet. We had different Puppet modules to initially build in the public cloud and different Puppet modules to build on-prem. So we started investigating containers, about 5 years ago, because containers were good at abstracting the underlying cloud provider, packaging all the dependencies. And once we had containers done, we needed an orchestration mechanism to run containers at scale. So that's where we ended up with, eventually, we started with Cattle and ended up with Kubernetes as the container orchestration engine. The benefit of this engineering work for us was that we were able to build immutable and consistent infrastructure pipelines. So if someone wanted a Kubernetes cluster, it was as simple as clicking a button in our CI/CD tooling, and you'd have a Kubernetes cluster with all the base services installed and deployed within minutes. And we were always looking to speed up the process. I remember the first time we sort of built a cluster, it took us about 3 hours to build the cluster, deploy all the workloads, and have all the basic services up and running. We sort of kept chipping away at it, kept iterating, and eventually we ended up, being able to build production-grade clusters with all the workloads deployed in less than an hour. And, because we got pretty good at it, we were able to solve the next problem. So I'm a big Star Wars fan, and in my personal opinion, this was the biggest, flaw in the plot line in the original, trilogy. That, I would think the Emperor failed his BCP plan because he didn't have a second Death Star. So the idea was that, we wanted to do sort of multi-cluster. And the reason was that we were a lean team. We didn't want to work at night. We were all lazy. We were like, we're not going to stay up at night to rebuild our clusters. We did immutable infrastructure anyway. So to patch it, it meant we were going to delete our cluster and build it back. And the benefit of that was you could easily sort of do security code updates during business hours. We didn't have to ask for outages. We basically told business, this is the time we are rebuilding one production site. Nothing's going to happen. You just need to be aware that something's happening. And that definitely helped us, right? The fact that we could rebuild production clusters in an hour, and it also saved us from human error. I'll talk about a personal story. I'm not sure if anyone's done this themselves, but I managed to delete a production cluster accidentally because I was trying to delete something else, but I didn't look. I was trying to multitask too much. I was like, I need to delete this cluster, but I didn't realize the drop-down said prod, and I clicked OK, and then I watched in horror, oh, I deleted prod. And it was too late because I just had to wait for it to finish its job and rebuild. But fortunately, no one noticed anything. I just notified business that, oh, we lost a prod cluster. In an hour, it'll be back. You shouldn't see any, impact. And, it was amazing because, people suddenly saw the value of all the work we did, right, in avoiding human error. So all of this infrastructure that we built initially was for, let's say, one dev team. Soon word spread out to other dev teams that, they were running containers, they were running containers at scale. Their deployment times went down from 3 hours. So our code releases used to take 2 to 3 hours. It came down to 5 minutes. So everyone wanted to, use our platform that we've built. Like Dim's mentioned, Kubernetes is the building block. And we sort of built our platform on top of K8s. And which brought us to the next challenge, was multi-tenancy. And this is my favorite example. Like, I've been on call after I built the platform for literally 3 years. So I've seen the good, the bad, the ugly. The first thing was this 3 a.m. call. I'm not sure if anyone's had a late night call asking something's broken, can you fix it? So the first 3 a.m. call was, my pods failed. I am running 2 pods. One of them's failed, so I'm seeing 50% failures. I'm like, yeah, dude, just delete the pod. This is like 3 a.m. He's like, no, this is prod. I'm not going to delete anything. You have to do it for me. I'm like, dude, you can't make it worse. Just delete it, and the scheduler will spit out the new one, and both of us can move on with our life. But he was too scared. So at 3 a.m., I got in, deleted the pod, and I said, dude, happy. So the next day I came to work, I did a lot of rage-fueled coding. So I said, lots of devs are consuming our platform. Let's enforce some standards. So we wrote our own CLI to sort of, wrap around kubectl at that point to allow people access to our cluster. So I was like, we are already parsing the manifest. So I can just apply some best practices to make sure there are, let's say, to start off with, readiness probes on your pods, liveness probes. So if you do not have one of these, your workload cannot be deployed to any environment. Then I went on to add, container image scanning, memory limits, so we could, size the cluster accordingly. And, still we had issues. The next issue was RBAC. Again, another midnight call. A dev calls me up. He was trying to release some code to, a test environment. I don't know why he was doing it at midnight. But he called me to complain that, I was supposed to delete the pod, but I deleted the node. And I was like, that's OK. Which environment is this? Is this prod? He's like, no, this is test. I'm like, that's fine. This is Saturday night. I was like, Monday, I'll look at it. He's like, can't you look at it right now? I'm like, dude, it's test. Let me sleep. We'll do it on Monday. So Sunday afternoon, I was sitting home, not doing anything important. So I thought, let me just see, what has he done? So that cluster was supposed to have 20 nodes, and 10 nodes were missing. So I called him up. At what point do you realize that you're not doing the right thing? Right, you were supposed to delete a pod, and now 10 nodes are missing. Like, doesn't it make sense to you that, something unintended is happening here? So that led me to enforce RBAC at the cluster level, that, you shouldn't be doing something, even if it's dev, that you're not allowed to do. The next challenge I had was like container scanning. So I'm not sure about the devs here, but our devs only wanted to check in their line of code, deploy it, and move on. They didn't care about what happened with it, or if there were vulnerabilities in the packaging. So I enforced container scanning to force people that you need to do the right thing. And sure enough, the build started breaking because there were vulnerabilities in the container images. And the next request I get is, in your CLI, can you write a flag to bypass container scanning? So I wrote an extra flag in the CLI to bypass container scanning. Sure enough, every dev of those 300 devs is now skipping the container scanning. And I'm like, what's the point of this? But me being me, and I'm like a sneaky guy, so I went in, added some Prometheus metrics in the CLI, so we would push all the metrics through a Prometheus gateway, so I knew who exactly is using the flag and which service has how many vulnerabilities, so I could go to their managers and say, do you want to do something about it? Sure enough, they were like, yeah, let's enforce container scanning at deployment time. So I enforced deployment scanning at deployment time. But because everyone was skipping the build time scanning, so it caught them out at deployment. And I got the next feature request. Can you skip deployment scanning in dev test? Just scan it in stage and prod. I was like, sure. If that's what you want, you are my customer. I'll write that extra add-on to it. It's a small flag for me. So I wrote that next flag that they will just skip it in dev test, and prod and stage, we will enforce the standard. And that led to the next midnight call. We had a prod release, but we can't deploy to prod because your container scanning's not allowing us to deploy to prod. I was like, okay, did you test it in dev or test? Yeah, dev test, so, and I asked them, did you test it in stage, actually? And they were like, oh, we went from dev test to prod, so we didn't really pick up the image vulnerabilities in stage. I'm like, that's what it's there for. So they're like, how can you disable it right now? I'm like, no, I'm not disabling it right now. You go to business and explain to them why you can't deploy to prod right now. And sure enough, that was the best way to sort of educate the developers. Once they realized their code's not going to go to prod, next day there was a CI plan to run image scanning every few hours on the base images and alert them to tell them that now there's a vulnerability and it'll break the production deployment, so you better patch it now. So after I was done in about 6 months of applying incremental standard enforcement, this is what we ended up with. But the benefits of this were amazing, right? For example, we had this improved security posture. I remember Spectre Meltdown bugs came out. Most of the organization was talking about how we're going to patch stuff. And they came to us, you run your own infrastructure, what's your plan? And I was like, oh, it's already in prod. It's been in, all our clusters were rebuilt. Everything's running in prod for a week. What are you talking about? And they're like, really? I'm like, sure. Next was the speed to market, right? A lot of the times we could sort of, deploy, code which hadn't been through the full integration cycle because it was a business demand to prod, simply because of the fact that it was as easy to roll back as it was to deploy a new version. And the last but not least was ability to respond to events. I live in Australia, and we've had like really wild weather in the last few years. So I remember Christmas Eve, I get a call that there is a massive thunderstorm approaching, and the weather department's issued an advisory. So we expect, the general trend is after a weather event, everyone logs into the online portal to check whether they are covered or not. And if they are covered, the next thing is a claim to sort of, claim for hail damage. And sure enough, that was the business call. Can you increase capacity? So 5 minutes later, we had scaled out our production clusters, all of them by 100% capacity. And that's what values to the customer, that they were able to validate their policies, lodge their claims, and consume the service as it was designed to. And that was like the first real use case where I found that this is what matters to the end customer and to the users. Thank you.